The first question I had was from Corey, and she was asking what is the difference between the various blurs that are available in PaintShop. So the blur is available under Adjust, Blur, and we have here Average Blur, Blur More, Gaussian Blur, Motion Blur, and Radial Blur. Well, Average Blur, Blur More, this is just like a one click. It adds some blur. Gaussian Blur, well, you've seen that very often. We use it in many situations. But what about the other ones? Well, the Motion Blur, as its name indicates, it has to do with motion. So, for example, on my image, if I add a motion blur, I can choose the angle, and it will usually be associated with some speed. To make it more interesting, the best way would be to extract some areas and make a blur on that instead of having a blur on everything. So for example, I'm going to use my favorite technique to make a selection, and I'm going to select part of the hat, the shirt, the leg, the foot, here. So this is going to be my selection. I will right click and promote that selection to its own layer. I will deselect, and now I can add the blur just to that section, and it won't have an impact on the rest of the photo. So I can go to Adjust, Blur, Motion Blur, and I'm choosing the angle because that's the angle of or the direction of the subject, and you can see that blur here appear. This is the maximum strength. It's 100%, and I think it has something to do with the actual size of the part. But if you want to have more, you will just do Control Y for repeat. Control Y, and you can see the effect. So this cyclist is going really fast. So this is one way you can use the motion blur. It's called motion blur usually because it has something to do with motion. You can have a rocket, you could have a ball that's going fast, something that would give a blur. Typically, that's the kind of blur you would get if you were to take a picture and you don't have a very fast camera. So that's just to replicate it. Another thing, you remember we did in the last class, we can also have, I'm just going to use line. I can use a motion blur to thicken an element. So if I have this line, I can go to Adjust and Motion Blur. I can have the motion blur, let's say I'm going to go downward, and you can see how it's making it thicker. And to make it not translucent, I will duplicate, merge down, duplicate, merge down, and I continue like that a few times until it gets pretty solid. So you can see how it is getting thicker now. That will usually work for something that doesn't have a pattern, obviously, because then the pattern will be blurred and you won't recognize it. But if you have a solid color, that might be a good way. Then we have the Radial Blur, and the Radial Blur, it has a lot of options. And one thing that I found was really useful is if you ever want to print a layout, especially if you want to do it in an album, sometimes they want what they call a bleed. And a bleed is something that is going to be slightly wider than your page so that when they cut, if they don't cut perfectly on the edge, you'll end up with something white. So in that case, for example, this is just an example. This is only 600 by 600. I would have to have something bigger. But let's say that I have my background. I'm going to promote that. And let's say that the printer wants to have something with a little gap on each side. So maybe it will want 650 pixels everywhere, because they want a little bit of color because they don't want to have something white. What you can do then is you duplicate, and on the bottom one, you apply that radial blur. So the blur, radial blur, and you go with zoom. Okay. And you can see how it's going on all directions. Let's just increase the strength, and you can see how it goes. You see, it fills in. I'll go maximum, and let's hide the top. You see, this is what it looks like. In itself, it's not much, although you can use that as a background paper. Why not? But if you want to send that to a printer, you can duplicate because you don't want to have something too translucent. Merge down. You can do that a couple of times, just like we did earlier. Merge down. So now when the printer will print the page, whatever size it is, and they cut it, if it's not cut perfectly on the edge, it really won't show like a white element on a dark background. So at that time, you would send a merged copy of this to the printer, and that would work. So that's if you need to print or to send to a printer or print shop, not a printer from your desk, but a print shop, and they ask you for bleed. This is what it is. The bleed is the outside, the extra that is used to avoid a white edge. The blur can also be used, the radial blur, for an effect. So again, I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to promote the background, just have more flexibility. And I can go to adjust, blur, radial blur. Now I have the zoom. I can use the same thing as I did with the layout and make a zoom effect. And of course, in this case, you won't see because there's another copy on top. But this is what it looks like. And then what I can do is make a selection, maybe a circle around my flower. I might add feathering. I would invert, Control-Shift-I, and delete and deselect, and you can see how it can be interesting. So that can also be one way to focus on one part of a photo. So it could be somebody's face, it could be a landmark, it could be another object. That's another way you can do it. But what I'm going to do here, I'm going to promote this selection. Okay, I'm going to hide this one. Actually, no, I'm going to keep this one. So what else I can do with that blur? I can use the blur, radial blur, and there are other options. I can spin and I can twirl. And they also give some interesting effects. So if I spin, you will see that the blur is going to be going in a circle. And in a circle or elliptic, in this case, because my image is rectangular, that's what it's going to do. And you have different strength. And you can also offset from horizontal or vertical. So maybe the center, maybe your flower or your element is not in the center and you might want to offset. Those are options. Or you can twirl, and twirl is going to have, like in the zoom blur, it was going straight out. In the spin, it's going straight around. For the twirl, it's like in between, and you'll be able to choose an angle. So if the angle, let's say, is 20 or 25, or you'll see that it's not going to be straight out. That is going to be the option for 0 angle. And you should see those lines are going to be at an angle. You can see how it's spinning. Those can be very pretty depending on the kind of image you have and the kind of effect you want to get. And just for fun, this is similar to other distortion effects under the effects. But this is for blur, and it's really, really cute, and you can use many things. You can make frames around that, etc. Okay, and yeah. Okay, so that's an overview of the different blur effects that are available in PaintShop. You can certainly play with them. I'm sure you can discover different ways you can use them. Hey there! I hope you found this information helpful. If you're curious to dive deeper and explore more about PaintShop Pro, we've got a wealth of resources waiting for you in our membership area. There, you'll find in-depth classes, workshops, Q&A sessions, and much more to help you enhance your PaintShop Pro and digital scrapbooking skills. Feel free to check it out. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the campus!